Welcome. Before we begin, let yourself settle into a calm place. The screen before you is gently dimming, fading into the quiet embrace of night. Soon it will be completely dark, leaving you undisturbed. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and allow your imagination to guide you. Tonight, we drift back more than 2,000 years, to the warm sands and cool waters of ancient Egypt. Imagine the Nile River flowing under the silver glow of the moon. The air is heavy with the scent of lotus flowers, and the sound of water against stone temples echoes softly. In this timeless place lived one of history's most captivating figures, Queen Cleopatra VII. Her name alone stirs visions of beauty, power, and mystery. Cleopatra was not just a queen, she was the last of the pharaohs of Egypt, belonging to the Ptolemaic dynasty, a family of Greek origin who ruled Egypt after the time of Alexander the Great. Born in 69 BCE, she grew up in a palace filled with marble columns, golden chambers, and scrolls of knowledge from the great library of Alexandria. Even as a child, she would have heard the murmur of priests reciting hymns to the gods, and the whispers of court officials discussing the fragile balance of power that surrounded her family's throne. Unlike many rulers of her time, Cleopatra learned the Egyptian language, embracing the traditions of the land she ruled. While her ancestors spoke mainly Greek, she chose to become a true pharaoh of Egypt, connecting with her people through their tongue, their rituals, and their gods. It was this choice that made her stand apart, beloved by some, feared by others. Picture her as a young woman, standing upon the palace balcony, watching the Nile shimmer in the light of dawn. She was educated in mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and medicine. In her presence, scholars debated the movements of the stars, while she listened and learned. She grew not only in knowledge but in determination, understanding that her destiny was tied to the survival of Egypt itself. Her reign began at a time of great uncertainty. Rome's power was expanding, and Egypt was both a jewel to be admired and a prize to be claimed. Cleopatra stepped into this world at the age of 18, sharing the throne with her younger brother. The palace halls were filled with intrigue, as alliances shifted and whispers of betrayal traveled through the marble corridors. Yet Cleopatra's mind was sharp and her spirit unyielding. She learned quickly that to survive, she would need not just charm, but wisdom, strategy, and courage. Tonight, as you rest, think of her not only as a queen wrapped in gold, but as a woman navigating a world of politics and power. Behind the shimmering veil of legend was a figure who dreamed, who feared, and who hoped for her land's survival. The mystery of Cleopatra lies not just in her beauty, but in her ability to remain unforgettable through the ages. Let the calm of the Nile carry you deeper into rest. The sound of gentle waves and the stillness of the desert night surround you. Soon, you will follow Cleopatra further, into alliances, battles, and dreams that shaped her life. But for now, allow her story to drift into your thoughts like a lullaby from the ancient world. The night is calm, and the story drifts onward. Imagine yourself still by the Nile, the soft rush of water against its banks a steady rhythm. Above, the stars spread wide across the sky, the same stars that once guided the destiny of pharaohs. Tonight, we move deeper into Cleopatra's world, a world where power was fragile and survival demanded not only beauty, but wisdom sharper than any sword. When Cleopatra first rose to the throne, she was not alone. According to ancient tradition, she was to rule with her younger brother, Ptolemy Asiri. He was just a child, and their partnership was never one of harmony. Behind palace doors, guardians, advisors, and generals whispered, each one eager to guide, or control, the throne. Cleopatra's independence, her intelligence, and her desire to lead made her both admired and feared within these walls. Imagine the grand palace at Alexandria, corridors of polished stone lit by flickering torches. Through those long halls, echoes of disputes and secrets would carry. Cleopatra, still young yet already sharp-minded, walked these paths with measured steps. Every glance, every word spoken by the courtiers carried hidden meaning. In such a place, even silence was political. It was not long before conflict broke into the open. Factions formed, some supporting Cleopatra, others standing behind her brother. Tension grew like storm clouds over the desert. And beyond Egypt's borders, the great power of Rome watched closely. For Rome, Egypt was not merely another land. It was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, rich with grain, gold, and the lifeblood of the Nile. Whoever held Egypt held great power. One can imagine Cleopatra in these days of uncertainty, still determined, still standing tall. She reached out to the traditions of her land, presenting herself as the living embodiment of Isis, the goddess of motherhood and magic. With golden jewelry and flowing robes, she became not only a queen, but a divine figure to her people. Yet the more she shone, the more shadows gathered around her. In 48 BCE, a storm of events unfolded. Civil war raged in Rome, as Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great fought for control of the empire. This war spilled into Egypt, changing Cleopatra's fate forever. Her brother's advisors, fearing her strength, drove her from Alexandria. Imagine her leaving the palace, the stone halls fading into the distance, the sound of the city swallowed by the desert winds. But Cleopatra was not one to vanish quietly. She gathered her loyal supporters, forming a plan that would bring her back into the heart of power. Across the sands, under the silent stars, she waited for the moment when fate and courage would meet. That moment would come in the form of an alliance unlike any other, an encounter with Julius Caesar himself. For now, as you drift deeper into rest, hold the image of Cleopatra, not as the legend she would become, but as a young queen struggling against forces greater than herself. The desert is silent, the Nile continues its endless flow, and above, the constellations gleam as if watching history unfold. In the stillness of night, her story whispers onward, carrying you into dreams. The story drifts onward, soft as the desert wind. Imagine Alexandria in the year 48 BCE, a city alive with whispers of war and destiny. Beyond its grand marble walls, the Mediterranean Sea rolled endlessly, carrying with it the weight of Rome's civil conflict. In the midst of this turbulence, a young queen prepared for one of history's most legendary encounters. Cleopatra, exiled from her palace and stripped of her throne, did not surrender. Instead, she waited, patient as the Nile itself. Far from the heart of Alexandria, she gathered her allies and planned her return. And then, fate delivered an unexpected opportunity. Julius Caesar, victor in Rome's struggle against Pompey, arrived in Egypt. He was not only a general, but the most powerful man in the known world. For Cleopatra, this was more than chance. It was a turning point. History tells us that Cleopatra devised a daring plan. She would not approach Caesar as a supplicant, but as a queen who demanded recognition. The story passed down through generations speaks of her secret entry into the palace, wrapped in a carpet, or perhaps a linen sack, carried past the guards and placed before Caesar himself. Picture that moment, the quiet chamber lit by oil lamps, the fabric unrolled, and Cleopatra emerging with grace and poise. Her presence was unlike any other. She spoke not only with charm but with intellect, weaving her words with the wisdom of a scholar and the confidence of a ruler. Caesar, a man hardened by campaigns and politics, found himself captivated, not merely by her beauty, but by her spirit, her sharp mind, and her determination to reclaim her throne. Imagine the two of them, seated in a chamber overlooking the harbor of Alexandria. Beyond the windows, the sea glimmered under moonlight, ships swaying gently with the tide. Inside, their voices rose and fell like the waves. Cleopatra speaking of Egypt's future, Caesar considering Rome's power. In those quiet exchanges, an alliance was born. For Cleopatra, this was more than survival. It was a chance to protect her kingdom against foreign domination, to ensure that Egypt would not fade under Rome's shadow. For Caesar, it was both political strategy and fascination with a queen who embodied the very spirit of the ancient Nile. Together, their partnership reshaped the fate of two worlds. Outside the palace walls, tension still rumbled. Cleopatra's brother, Ptolemy Extru, and his advisors resisted, unwilling to yield power. Yet within, Cleopatra had secured the support of Rome's greatest leader. Slowly, the tide began to turn in her favor. As you rest tonight, imagine the silence of that chamber where two of history's most famous figures first met. Oil lamps flicker, shadows dance across marble walls, and the gentle sound of water drifts in from the harbor. It is a moment suspended in time, quiet, delicate, yet powerful enough to alter the course of empires. Let the thought of it lull you into deeper calm. The desert is quiet, the Nile flows steady, and the stars shine as they did over Alexandria long ago. Cleopatra's journey is far from complete, but tonight she has stepped back into destiny. The night deepens, and with it, Cleopatra's path grows more turbulent. The year is still 48 BCE. Outside the grand city of Alexandria, the tension between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy's Harry erupts into open conflict. The Nile, usually so calm, now reflects the fires of war. With Julius Caesar at her side, Cleopatra found herself in a precarious balance. Rome's general had the strength of legions, but Egypt was a land proud and divided. Ptolemy's advisors, determined to keep power in their grasp, rallied armies against her. Imagine the soft glow of torches lining the riverbanks, soldiers gathering beneath the stars, their armor glimmering faintly in the moonlight. Yet even as war brewed, Cleopatra remained composed. Within the palace walls, she and Caesar planned with quiet intensity. Scrolls were spread across marble tables, maps of the Delta marked with ink. The air was heavy with incense, but beneath the calm lay urgency. For Cleopatra, this was not merely a struggle for a throne, it was survival for herself, her people, and Egypt's independence. When battle came, it was swift and fierce. The streets of Alexandria echoed with the clash of steel and the cries of soldiers. Fires rose against the night sky, their reflection dancing across the waves of the harbor. Caesar's forces, though small, were disciplined. Cleopatra's supporters fought with devotion, seeing her as the rightful queen. The Nile, ancient witness to countless struggles, carried their sounds into the silence of the desert beyond. History recalls the Battle of the Nile as a moment where destiny itself seemed to hold its breath. Ptolemy XO, in his desperate bid to retain control, marched against Caesar and Cleopatra. But fortune did not favor him. Amid the chaos, he was driven back, and ultimately, his life ended as he attempted to flee across the river. The waters swallowed him, as though the Nile itself chose Cleopatra's fate. From this storm of fire and fear, Cleopatra emerged triumphant. Still young, yet already hardened by struggle, she stood at Caesar's side as the undisputed ruler of Egypt. In the quiet that followed, the palace once more filled with music, the scent of lotus, and the hum of voices. But beneath the calm, the bond between her and Caesar grew stronger. A partnership not only of power, but of intrigue and legend. As you rest tonight, picture the Nile returning to stillness. The smoke of battle fades, the torches burn low, and once again the stars reclaim the sky. Cleopatra has secured her throne, but her journey is only beginning. More than a queen, she is now a symbol, destined to walk beside the greatest powers of her age. The night carries us further along the Nile, where silence has returned after the storms of battle. Cleopatra, now secure upon her throne, stood not in isolation but beside the most powerful man in Rome. With Julius Caesar as her ally, the balance of power shifted, not only in Egypt but across the wider Mediterranean world. Their partnership soon blossomed into something deeper. Cleopatra, still in her early 20s, radiated confidence, intelligence, and a sense of destiny. Caesar, hardened by decades of war and political struggle, discovered in her an equal, one who matched his ambition and surpassed many in wisdom. She was not a mere companion. She was a queen who carried with her the ancient soul of the Nile. Imagine the palace at Alexandria after victory. The torches burned softly, music drifted through the gilded halls, and the fragrance of lotus flowers and incense lingered in the air. In private chambers, Caesar and Cleopatra spoke late into the night. Their conversations were not idle whispers but discussions of empires, of Rome and Egypt, of dreams stretching far beyond the horizon. Their words blended with the gentle hum of the city, a harmony of two worlds entwining. From this union came a child, Ptolemy XV Philopator Philometor Caesar, known to history as Caesarion, Little Caesar. Picture the moment of his birth, the soft cries of a newborn wrapped in linen, Cleopatra gazing upon him with pride and quiet resolve. For her, Caesarion was more than a son. He was a living bridge, a symbol of unity between the old kingdom of the Nile and the rising power of Rome. But beyond the palace walls, whispers stirred uneasily. In Rome, senators questioned Caesar's closeness to this foreign queen. Many feared that Cleopatra's influence could sway him, that her presence might draw Rome into the orbit of Egypt. Still, Caesar did not falter. He welcomed her to Rome itself, and Cleopatra arrived not as a guest, but as a sovereign ruler. Imagine the astonishment of the Romans as her barge sailed down the Tiber. Draped in silk, adorned with golden statues, attendants scattering lotus blossoms, she entered the city like a vision from another world. To some, she was enchanting, a queen who seemed touched by divinity. To others, she was unsettling, a reminder that Rome's power was not unchallenged, that its leader was enthralled by a woman who represented an ancient, enduring civilization. For a brief time, their world seemed unshakable. In Rome, Cleopatra was housed in Caesar's villa, her presence a constant subject of fascination and scandal. Together they dined beneath starry skies, their words weaving politics with philosophy, laughter with strategy. Caesar introduced her not only as his ally, but as the Queen of Egypt. To many Romans, this was unthinkable, for no foreign monarch had ever held such a place of honor in their city. Yet beneath the beauty of these nights lay a fragile truth. Rome was restless. The Senate feared Caesar's growing power, and his closeness to Cleopatra only deepened their unease. As Cleopatra watched from the shadows of Roman gardens, she must have sensed the tension in the air, the silent storm building around the man she trusted. As you rest tonight, hold the image of Cleopatra both as queen and mother. Her child beside her, her gaze steady upon the horizon. The Nile flows eternal, the Tiber glimmers under moonlight, and across both rivers, her story stretches like a bridge of destiny. The night is calm, the stars unchanging, and history waits quietly for its next turn. The quiet flow of history carries us forward, across the sea from Egypt to the heart of Rome. Imagine the city in 46 BCE, its streets crowded with merchants, senators, soldiers, and poets. Rome was the beating heart of an empire, alive with ambition and tension. And into this restless city sailed Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, her presence like a ripple spreading across still waters. She did not arrive humbly. Her royal barge moved slowly along the Tiber, draped with silks and adorned with golden carvings. Musicians played soft melodies, attendants carried lotus blossoms, and torches flickered along the riverbanks as astonished Romans gathered to watch. To them, she was both a vision and a challenge, an exotic queen who carried with her the mystery of the East. In Caesar's villa, Cleopatra was given a place of honor. Picture the garden at dusk, olive trees swaying gently, fountains murmuring, and soft lanterns glowing as the evening air cooled. Within those shaded walls, Cleopatra and Caesar dined together, speaking of politics, astronomy, and the fate of nations. To the Romans, her presence was strange, even unsettling, for never before had a foreign monarch been welcomed so intimately into the heart of their republic. Cleopatra walked through Rome with quiet confidence. Her robes of fine linen, her jewels shimmering in the sunlight, drew gazes wherever she passed. Some admired her grace, others whispered warnings of her influence. Senators debated in hushed voices, fearful that her bond with Caesar might shift Rome's balance of power. Yet among the people, there was fascination. Poets spoke of her beauty, merchants marveled at her wealth, and philosophers wondered at her wisdom. At her side was young Caesarion, her child with Caesar. Though only a baby, he symbolized something far greater. To Cleopatra, he was the living future of Egypt, carrying the blood of both the Nile and Rome. To others, however, he was a threat, proof that Caesar might one day dream of creating a dynasty, crowned not in Rome but with the legacy of the pharaohs. As months passed, Cleopatra adapted to Roman life with quiet elegance. She visited temples, attended feasts, and observed the Senate from a careful distance. In her heart, she carried Egypt's traditions, yet she understood Rome's strength. By standing beside Caesar, she sought to weave her kingdom's destiny with the empire that ruled the Mediterranean. Yet beneath the calm surface, shadows gathered. The Senate grew uneasy, whispers of conspiracy circling through marble halls. Many believed Caesar's closeness to Cleopatra signaled a dangerous shift, that Rome might bend under the influence of a foreign queen. Cleopatra herself must have sensed it, the cool glances of senators, the silence that followed her footsteps, the weight of suspicion pressing against her presence. Still, for a moment in time, Cleopatra lived in both worlds. By day she walked among Rome's citizens, and by night she dreamed of the Nile. Imagine her gazing out from Caesar's villa, the Tiber glimmering in moonlight, recalling the wide, calm waters of her homeland. The stars above Rome were the same that shone over Egypt, eternal witnesses to her journey. As you drift into rest, let that image guide you. The queen far from her native land, yet carrying it within her heart, her destiny stretching across two great rivers. The night is quiet, the air soft, and the story of Cleopatra flows on like a gentle current. The night moves us deeper into the heart of Rome, where shadows begin to lengthen across marble walls. The year is 44 BCE, and the city hums with unrest. Julius Caesar, triumphant and powerful, holds the loyalty of armies and the admiration of many citizens. Yet within the Senate, whispers of discontent stir like cold winds. Cleopatra, living quietly in Caesar's villa, felt those winds in the silence of Roman corridors, in the glances of men who feared her presence. To the people of Egypt, Cleopatra remained their queen, but in Rome she was an outsider, a figure of fascination and suspicion. Senators saw her as a symbol of Caesar's ambitions, his willingness to stand above tradition, to reshape the republic into something new. For them, Cleopatra's presence was not merely unusual, it was dangerous. Imagine the villa at night. Cleopatra walks through its gardens, olive leaves rustling in the breeze, fountains murmuring softly. Above, the stars glimmer, unchanged from those that shone over Alexandria. She holds Caesarion in her arms, whispering lullabies in the Egyptian tongue, a song of the Nile carried across foreign skies. Yet her thoughts wander, uneasy, sensing that the peace she has known in Rome cannot last. Caesar's bond with Cleopatra was not hidden. He built a golden statue of her in the temple of Venus Genitrix, a gesture that astonished and unsettled the Roman people. To elevate a foreign queen to divine status was unheard of, a bold declaration that blurred the line between politics and passion. To Cleopatra, it was a moment of honor, proof that her place beside Caesar was not in shadow but in light. But to Rome's senators, it was a warning, a sign that Caesar might dream of monarchy, with Cleopatra as his queen. The days grew tense. Murmurs of conspiracy echoed through the Senate, carried on careful voices and guarded eyes. Cleopatra, though far from the chamber of debate, must have felt the weight of those whispers. She had lived her entire life surrounded by intrigue, by shifting loyalties and sudden betrayals. The patterns were familiar, and in Rome she saw them unfolding once more. When she dined with Caesar in the evenings, the music of flutes and lyres filling the air, she would watch him carefully. He spoke of reforms, of the future of Rome, his voice calm and steady. Yet beyond the villa walls, anger sharpened like a blade. The very senators who praised him in public were meeting in secret, planning an act that would alter the course of history. On the Ides of March, that act came to life. Caesar entered the Senate, cloaked in dignity, unaware of the daggers waiting for him. Cleopatra was not there. She remained in the villa, perhaps cradling her child, perhaps gazing out at the Tiber. But when the news reached her, the world shifted. Caesar, her ally, her partner, the father of her son, had fallen beneath the knives of those he once called friends. Imagine her grief in that moment. The villa silent, her attendants hushed, the night heavy with sorrow. The future she had woven with Caesar seemed to unravel in a single instant. Yet Cleopatra was not one to surrender to despair. In her heart, she carried Egypt, and for Egypt she would endure. As you rest tonight, hold the image of Cleopatra standing alone in a foreign land, the glow of lamplight falling softly around her, her gaze steady despite the storm. The Nile still flowed, distant yet eternal, a reminder that her story was not yet finished. The night deepens, and with it, the queen's path turns once more toward destiny. The silence of grief gave way to the noise of chaos. After the death of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE, Rome was thrown into turmoil. Senators celebrated their deed as the salvation of the Republic, but the city did not rejoice. Instead, unrest spread like wildfire. Crowds mourned Caesar, riots broke out, and fear rippled through the streets. In the midst of this storm, Cleopatra remained in Rome for only a short time. She had lost her protector, and though she carried his child, she understood that the city was no longer safe. Imagine her departure. A queen who had entered Rome in splendor now slipped quietly onto a ship, the Tiber's dark waters reflecting torchlight as she sailed away. The barge moved silently into the night, carrying Cleopatra and young Caesarion back toward Egypt. Behind her, Rome echoed with anger and ambition, but ahead lay the Nile, the eternal river that anchored her spirit. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra returned to her palace with renewed determination. She had lost Caesar, yet she remained queen. Her throne was secure, her people loyal, and her child the living bond between Egypt and Rome. In her chambers, adorned with golden carvings and lotus flowers, she considered the uncertain future. The Roman world was fractured, split between men who claimed Caesar's legacy, Octavian, his adopted heir, and Mark Antony, his brilliant general. Their rivalry would soon reach across seas, pulling Cleopatra into the currents of destiny once again. For the moment, though, she turned her gaze inward. Egypt flourished under her careful rule. The Nile's floods brought fertile harvests, the temples echoed with hymns to the gods, and trade flowed through Alexandria's bustling harbor. Cleopatra moved among her people with grace, presenting herself as the living goddess Isis, a protector and mother to her kingdom. Her voice carried reassurance, even as she weighed the shadows gathering in the distance. It was in these years that her image became more than regal. On coins minted in her name, Cleopatra appeared with sharp features, a strong nose, and a gaze of command. She did not hide behind idealized beauty, but embraced the portrait of power. To hold such a coin was to see Egypt's strength in her face, to feel the reach of her rule. Yet beyond the desert, Rome's struggle deepened. Octavian and Antony vied for control, and the Mediterranean trembled under their ambition. Cleopatra, always a careful strategist, watched and waited. She knew that Egypt could not remain untouched. Sooner or later, Rome's tides would surge against her shores. When Mark Antony summoned her in 41 BCE, history shifted once more. He called upon her to answer for her alliance with Caesar, to explain her loyalty. Cleopatra, ever aware of the power of presence, prepared not with armies but with pageantry. She sailed to meet Antony in Tarsus upon the Cydnus River, her barge shimmering with gold and purple sails, her attendants dressed as nymphs, the air filled with the scent of incense. She appeared not as a supplicant, but as a goddess descending upon the waters. Imagine Antony watching from the shore as Cleopatra's barge glided into view. Soldiers and citizens alike fell silent, struck by the sight. Cleopatra reclined beneath a canopy of silk, her form glowing in the afternoon sun. Musicians played, perfume filled the air, and the Queen of Egypt stepped once more into history's stage, not in defeat, but in mastery. As you rest tonight, hold that image in your mind, Cleopatra sailing toward destiny, her spirit unbroken, her resolve eternal. The river carries her forward, the winds lift her sails, and the stars above watch quietly, knowing her story is far from its end. The waters of the Cydnus shimmered as Cleopatra's barge glided into the city of Tarsus. The year was 41 BCE, and Mark Antony awaited her, a general of immense reputation. Antony was known for his boldness in battle, his booming voice, and his appetite for life. Yet as he watched Cleopatra approach, even his confidence gave way to wonder. The queen had staged her arrival with unmatched brilliance. Draped in robes of purple, the color of royalty, she reclined beneath a canopy of silk, attendants fanning her with feathers of peacock and ostrich. Musicians played soft flutes and lyres, while incense drifted like mist across the deck. To Antony and those gathered on the shore, it was as though the goddess Isis herself had descended upon the river. Cleopatra understood power, not only in politics but in spectacle, and this moment would live forever in memory. When they met, it was not merely a meeting of allies but of equals. Cleopatra spoke with calm authority, her words weaving together wisdom and subtle charm. Antony, drawn to her intelligence and her radiant presence, found himself captivated. Though Rome saw her as a foreign queen, Antony saw in her the strength of a ruler who could stand beside him, not behind him. Their bond grew quickly. In feasts held at Tarsus, Cleopatra dazzled Antony and his companions with endless displays of wealth and wit. She hosted banquets lit by hundreds of lamps, tables heavy with silver and gold, food from across the Mediterranean, and wine flowing freely. But it was not extravagance alone that impressed. It was her mind, sharp and deliberate, steering conversations toward alliances, trade, and the balance of power. Soon Antony followed her to Alexandria, where their bond deepened amid the splendor of the Egyptian court. Picture the palace at night, its columns glowing in torchlight, gardens filled with the fragrance of jasmine, and music echoing softly across marble halls. Together they dined, laughed, and spoke of dreams beyond borders. Antony, accustomed to the strict formality of Roman life, found in Egypt a world of color, freedom, and passion, embodied by Cleopatra herself. For the queen, this alliance was more than companionship. It was a safeguard for Egypt's future. Rome was fractured between Antony in the east and Octavian in the west. By binding herself to Antony, Cleopatra ensured that Egypt would not stand isolated, but aligned with one of Rome's greatest powers. Their union was both political and personal, a weaving of hearts and empires. In time, Cleopatra bore Antony 3 children, twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and later Ptolemy Philadelphus. To her, they were not only children but symbols of a dynasty that might one day unite Egypt and Rome. Imagine her in the nursery, the flicker of oil lamps lighting her face as she watched them sleep, whispering prayers to the gods of the Nile for their protection. But in Rome, whispers grew louder. Octavian, shrewd and calculating, painted Cleopatra as a temptress who had ensnared Antony. Senators muttered that he was forgetting his Roman duty, surrendering to the luxuries of the East. The tension between Antony and Octavian deepened, and Cleopatra's name became the center of debate, both admired and feared. As you close your eyes tonight, picture Cleopatra in Alexandria's palace, seated beside Antony at a banquet, their laughter mingling with the music of flutes. Outside, the Nile flows beneath the stars, eternal and calm. Inside, 2 figures weave a bond that will shape the fate of empires. Their story, like the river, moves steadily forward, carrying them toward triumph, passion, and the shadows yet to come. The bond between Cleopatra and Mark Antony grew stronger with each passing season. In Alexandria, they built a world that blended Roman power with Egyptian splendor. To their followers, they were not merely lovers but rulers who shared a vision of empire and destiny. Yet to Rome, their union was troubling, a sign of division and danger. Imagine the halls of Alexandria's palace in these years. Banquets stretched long into the night, lit by the glow of thousands of oil lamps. Musicians played soft melodies while poets recited verses in Greek and Egyptian alike. Cleopatra and Antony reclined upon couches of gold and ivory, surrounded by attendants who brought wine, fruit, and exotic delicacies. Together they laughed, debated, and dreamed of a realm where East and West might be joined, not divided. Antony, captivated by Egypt's warmth and abundance, found in Cleopatra a companion who stirred both his heart and his ambition. She was not only his beloved but his ally, a ruler who matched his will with equal strength. In her presence, he spoke not as a Roman general, but as a partner in a shared destiny. Cleopatra, in turn, embraced this union as a safeguard for her kingdom, binding Egypt's future to Antony's rising power. But beyond the palace walls, Rome watched with suspicion. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and Antony's rival, used the relationship as a weapon. He whispered to senators that Antony was bewitched, that he had abandoned Rome for a queen of the East. Pamphlets and speeches painted Cleopatra as a seductress, a foreign danger whose influence threatened the Republic. The more Antony gave his heart to her, the more Octavian sharpened his words against them. Despite this, Antony and Cleopatra lived with splendor. They formed what was called the inimitable livers, a society dedicated to feasting, laughter, and philosophy. Nights were filled with celebration, yet beneath the joy lay serious undertones. In private, They discussed armies, alliances, and the balance of power. Cleopatra knew that Rome's judgment could not be ignored forever. Their children grew within the palace, symbols of a new dynasty. Cleopatra Selene, Alexander Helios, and Ptolemy Philadelphus carried both Egyptian and Roman blood, their futures woven into the fabric of two worlds. Cleopatra must have gazed at them often, her heart torn between the beauty of family and the weight of politics. She knew that their very existence would one day be contested, their lives bound to the struggles of empires. Meanwhile, Antony's absence from Rome fueled Octavian's rise. While Antony basked in Alexandria's brilliance, Octavian tightened his grip on the Senate, on legions, and on the people's imagination. He cast himself as the true heir of Caesar, the guardian of Roman tradition, while Antony was portrayed as a man lost to Eastern luxuries. Cleopatra, experienced in the ways of propaganda, understood the danger. She had seen how quickly perception could shift, how rumor could wound as deeply as a sword. Yet she held firm, believing that her partnership with Antony gave Egypt the protection it needed. As you rest tonight, picture the palace of Alexandria in twilight, its marble glowing soft beneath the setting sun. Inside, Cleopatra and Antony share wine and quiet laughter, their voices mingling with the music of flutes. Outside, the Nile flows calm, but far away in Rome, storms are gathering. The night is still, the stars timeless, yet history moves steadily toward a clash that will shape the fate of nations. The years that followed drew Antony once more toward Rome, though his heart remained in Alexandria. Political necessity demanded his return, for Octavian's power was rising quickly, and the Senate grew uneasy at Antony's absence. Cleopatra, left in Egypt, continued to rule with strength, her eyes ever fixed upon the shifting tides of Roman politics. In 40 BCE, Antony married Octavia, the sister of Octavian, in a bid to preserve peace between the two great rivals. To Rome, it was a gesture of unity. To Cleopatra, it was a reminder of the fragile loyalties of men. Yet she did not falter. She knew Antony's heart, and she knew, too, that politics in Rome was a game of appearances. The bond between them, though tested, was not broken. Imagine Antony in Rome, walking through marble halls heavy with whispers. Senators eyed him with suspicion, torn between loyalty and fear. Octavian, sharp and calculating, pressed every advantage, presenting himself as the true defender of the Republic. Antony, though still powerful, found his reputation stained by tales of his indulgence in Egypt, stories carefully spread by Octavian's supporters. Cleopatra's name was spoken often, sometimes with awe, more often with venom. In Alexandria, life moved with steady rhythm. The Nile rose and fell, bringing harvests to the fields. The harbor thrived with ships from Greece, Africa, and Asia. Within her palace, Cleopatra balanced the joy of her children with the weight of her crown. She attended temple ceremonies, appearing as Isis incarnate, offering prayers for Egypt's prosperity. She listened to scholars, debated philosophers, and ensured that the machinery of her kingdom never faltered. Yet in quiet moments, she must have wondered how long peace could last. By 37 BCE, Antony returned to the east. The marriage to Octavia had failed, and the alliance with Octavian grew thin. In Antioch, Antony and Cleopatra were reunited. Their meeting was not only the rekindling of affection, but the forging of renewed strategy. Cleopatra provided ships, soldiers, and resources, strengthening Antony's campaign against Parthia. In return, Antony recognized Caesarion as Caesar's true son and granted lands to Cleopatra and their children. Together, they stood not merely as lovers but as rulers of vast ambition. Cleopatra envisioned a Mediterranean, where Egypt's influence stretched once more beyond its borders, where her dynasty would thrive in strength and honor. Antony, drawn to her vision, found in Egypt a partner who matched his daring with wisdom. But Rome was not blind to these movements. Octavian, ever watchful, seized the chance to portray Antony as a man lost to foreign influence. Pamphlets depicted Cleopatra as a sorceress, binding Antony with spells. Rumors whispered that Antony dreamed of ruling Rome from Alexandria, of placing a crown upon Cleopatra's head. To the Roman people, the idea was scandalous. To Octavian, it was a weapon sharpened for war. Picture Cleopatra in these days, seated in a hall of marble and gold, scrolls spread before her, maps marked with ink, her children playing nearby. She bore the calm of one who had weathered storms, yet in her gaze was resolve. She had chosen her path, and it led toward confrontation. As you drift into rest, imagine the soft murmur of the Nile beyond the palace walls, the desert air cooling as night falls. Cleopatra's story, bound now to Antony's, moves forward like the current. Steady, unstoppable, carrying them both toward the horizon where love and empire meet, and where shadows gather with silent patience. The alliance between Cleopatra and Antony soon faced its first great trial. In 36 BCE, Antony marched eastward to confront the Parthians, Rome's formidable rivals who had long threatened the empire's eastern borders. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, supported him with ships, supplies, and treasure, binding Egypt's fate even more tightly to his campaigns. Yet war is rarely merciful, and this one would test both Antony's strength and Cleopatra's faith in their union. Imagine the preparations in Alexandria before the march. Soldiers gathered in the harbor, armor polished, banners lifted high. Cleopatra herself walked among them, offering words of encouragement, her presence a reminder that Egypt stood behind their cause. She had long understood the importance of morale, of presenting herself not only as queen but as guardian. To Antony, her support was invaluable. To her, the campaign was an investment in Egypt's survival. The march into Parthia, however, proved disastrous. The terrain was harsh, the Parthians skilled in swift cavalry attacks. Roman legions, though disciplined, struggled in the unforgiving deserts and mountains. Supply lines stretched thin, and hunger gnawed at the soldiers. Cleopatra, far away in Egypt, must have waited anxiously for news, listening to the whispers of messengers, studying the expressions of envoys who returned with troubling reports. When Antony's forces finally retreated, weakened and bloodied, the cost was heavy. Tens of thousands had perished, and the glory he sought was lost to dust. For Rome, it was a humiliation, and for Antony, a wound to his honor. Yet when he returned to Cleopatra, she did not greet him with reproach. Instead, she received him with dignity and care, tending to his spirit as much as to his reputation. Her palace became a refuge, a place where defeat could be softened by affection, where plans for the future could still take root. Picture the palace after his return. The grand halls were quieter now, the feasts less extravagant. Instead of laughter and music, there were conversations held in hushed tones, strategies revised, alliances reconsidered. Cleopatra, seated beside Antony, spoke of resilience. She reminded him that failure, though bitter, was not the end. The Nile itself taught this lesson each year, flooding fields and leaving destruction, only to recede and grant new life. Together they sought to rebuild. Antony granted more lands to Cleopatra, strengthening her position as Queen of Egypt and beyond. He recognized her children as rulers of territories, bestowing upon them titles that hinted at an empire yet to come. Cleopatra, holding her twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, must have dreamed of a dynasty stretching across east and west. To her, these gestures were not only gifts of affection but seeds of legacy. But in Rome, Octavian sharpened his rhetoric. He spread word of Antony's failures and Cleopatra's influence, weaving a tale of decadence and betrayal. To the Roman people, Antony was no longer a hero but a man enthralled by a queen who lured him away from duty. The Parthian disaster was more than a military setback, it was fuel for propaganda. As night falls in your thoughts, picture Cleopatra in her palace garden, gazing at the stars above the Nile. Her mind carries both the weight of disappointment and the spark of hope. She has stood through storms before, and she knows more will come. Yet her resolve is steady, her vision unbroken. The current of the Nile flows endlessly, and so too does her story, carrying her and Antony onward into the uncertain dawn. The shadow of the Parthian defeat lingered, yet Cleopatra and Antony refused to let despair define their future. In Alexandria, they turned their attention to rebuilding strength, both for themselves and for their children. What Antony had lost in reputation, he sought to restore through renewed displays of power. What Cleopatra feared in Rome's whispers, she sought to counter with symbols of dynasty and destiny. Imagine the palace of Alexandria in these years. The halls glowed once more with the light of oil lamps, though their feasts carried a deeper purpose than mere celebration. Scholars, priests, and generals gathered at Cleopatra's side, while Antony sat beside her in regal splendor. Their banquets became stages for politics. Each gesture, each word a performance meant to remind the world that their rule was not fading, but rising anew. In 34 BCE, they orchestrated what became known as the Donations of Alexandria. In a grand ceremony, Antony and Cleopatra presented their children as rulers of lands beyond Egypt. Cleopatra Selene and Alexander Helios were granted kingdoms, while young Ptolemy Philadelphus was given future domains. Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, was proclaimed as Caesar's rightful heir, King of Kings. The spectacle was dazzling. Picture the scene: Cleopatra seated in golden robes as Isis incarnate, Antony beside her in Roman armor, their children crowned with diadems, the air filled with incense and music. To those gathered, it was a vision of empire reborn. Yet to Rome, the message was scandalous. Octavian seized the moment, spinning the event into proof that Antony intended to abandon Rome and build a foreign dynasty in the east. He spoke to the Senate of betrayal, of Antony bowing before a queen, of Caesar's legacy handed not to Octavian but to Caesarion. Each word was sharpened like a blade, cutting deeper into Antony's reputation. Cleopatra, experienced in both politics and performance, must have known the risks. But she also understood the necessity. By elevating her children, she planted their names into history, ensuring that even Rome's disdain could not erase them. In her private chambers, she likely gazed upon them with quiet pride, whispering prayers to the gods for their protection. They were not only her legacy but her defiance against the tides pressing against her. Antony, too, sought to recover his standing. He planned campaigns to strengthen his control of the East, leaning on Cleopatra's resources and Egypt's wealth. The partnership between them deepened, not only in affection but in necessity. Together they stood against the encroaching power of Octavian, aware that every step brought them closer to confrontation. For the people of Alexandria, these were years of splendor. Festivals lit the city, trade flourished in the harbor, and the library continued to draw scholars from across the known world. Cleopatra moved through her capital with grace, her presence radiating confidence. She had weathered storms before, and with Antony at her side, she believed Egypt could withstand even Rome's rising wrath. But in Rome, Octavian was relentless. His words painted Cleopatra as a sorceress, a dangerous enchantress who had captured Antony's heart and mind. To the Roman people, the Queen of Egypt became a symbol of threat, the embodiment of foreign decadence. Each tale grew darker, each accusation heavier. In the Senate, Antony's allies dwindled, while Octavian's influence spread like fire. As you drift into rest tonight, picture the grand ceremony of the donations. Cleopatra and Antony seated in radiant splendor, their children crowned, the air alive with music and devotion. It was a moment of triumph, shimmering like starlight across the Nile. Yet beneath its beauty lay the quiet truth that triumph and tragedy often walk together, and the path of empire always leads toward shadows. The vision of empire that Cleopatra and Antony displayed in Alexandria sent ripples of unease across the Mediterranean. In Rome, Octavian seized the moment, sharpening his campaign of words into a weapon of war. The donations of Alexandria had given him the proof he needed, or at least the appearance of proof, that Antony sought to elevate a foreign queen and her children above the traditions of Rome. Imagine the Forum of Rome in these years. Senators gathering beneath marble columns, their voices heavy with accusation. Pamphlets spread through the streets, declaring that Antony no longer lived as a Roman, but as a servant of Cleopatra. Her name was spoken with venom, painted as a sorceress who had ensnared him, a queen who lured Rome's strength into the hands of Egypt. Octavian's words were chosen carefully, each one designed to stir fear and anger. Cleopatra, though distant, was no stranger to such shadows. She had been the subject of whispers since her youth, in Alexandria and beyond. Yet this campaign was different. It came not from rival courtiers but from the heart of Rome itself. She must have understood the weight of it. Perhaps pacing the halls of her palace, her gaze fixed upon maps of the Mediterranean, her mind calculating each move. Antony, for his part, was torn between two worlds. In Alexandria, he lived with splendor and love, his children playing in palace courtyards, his nights filled with laughter beside Cleopatra. Yet in Rome, his name grew darker by the day. Octavian worked tirelessly to convince the Senate that Antony had betrayed the Republic, that his loyalty was no longer to Rome, but to Egypt. The contrast between perception and reality grew sharper, and Antony's silence only deepened the wound. In 32 BCE, Octavian took his boldest step. He arranged for Antony's will, stored in the temple of the Vestal Virgins, to be read publicly. Whether the details were true or twisted mattered little. What Rome heard was enough. The will suggested that Antony intended to leave vast wealth and power to Cleopatra and her children, that he wished to be buried in Alexandria beside her. To the Roman people, it was a scandal. To Octavian, it was the final blow he needed. Imagine the uproar in the Senate, the murmurs spreading through the streets. Citizens shook their heads, soldiers muttered in anger, and Antony's reputation crumbled further. Cleopatra's image, once mysterious and alluring, was now painted as a threat to Roman identity itself. The idea of a foreign queen ruling from Alexandria, with Caesarion as heir to Caesar, ignited fear in the hearts of those who prized the Republic's legacy. Cleopatra, however, did not falter. In Alexandria, she prepared for the storm she knew was coming. Ships were built, soldiers trained, and supplies gathered. She moved through her city with calm authority, reassuring her people even as the horizon darkened. To them, she was still Isis incarnate, the mother who would defend Egypt against the world. Antony stood beside her, their partnership unshaken despite the storms. They held banquets not as idle celebrations, but as affirmations of their unity, reminders that even as Rome denounced them, they remained steadfast. Together they looked upon the Nile, its waters endless and eternal, a symbol of resilience. As you close your eyes tonight, picture Cleopatra at the palace balcony, the night breeze carrying the scent of lotus across the river. Torches flicker in the distance, soldiers prepare in silence, and the stars above shimmer like ancient witnesses. The clash between East and West is drawing near, yet in this moment, calm lingers. The Queen of Egypt stands resolute, her story flowing steadily toward the tide of history that awaits. The air of the Mediterranean grew heavy with expectation. By 31 BCE, the rivalry between Octavian and the alliance of Antony and Cleopatra could no longer be contained in whispers or propaganda. It would be decided not by words in the Senate, but by ships and soldiers upon the sea. The stage was set for Actium, a battle that would decide the fate of empires. In Alexandria, preparations consumed every hour. Cleopatra oversaw the building of ships, their hulls polished and fitted with bronze rams. Sails of deep purple and red were woven by skilled hands, while oarsmen trained upon the Nile, their strokes steady and strong. Imagine the harbor filled with this growing fleet, sunlight glinting off polished wood and shimmering waters, the sounds of hammering and chanting echoing through the air. Antony commanded legions still loyal to him, their armor shining beneath the Egyptian sun. He walked among his men, offering words of encouragement, reminding them of victories past. Yet even he could sense the weight of what lay ahead. Against Octavian, he would face not only soldiers but the force of Rome united. Cleopatra, always deliberate, prepared in her own way. She gathered supplies of grain, gold, and medicine, ensuring that her fleet would endure even a long campaign. She appeared among her people dressed in ceremonial robes, presenting herself as Isis incarnate, her presence a promise that Egypt would not falter. To her attendants, she spoke calmly. To her children, she whispered reassurances, though in her heart she must have felt the tremor of uncertainty. By late summer, their fleet sailed westward. Picture the sea at dawn, dozens of ships gliding across calm waters, sails swelling in the breeze, the horizon glowing with morning light. Cleopatra's barge, adorned with golden carvings and purple sails, stood at the center, a vision of majesty upon the waves. Soldiers, sailors, and attendants looked to her not only as queen but as symbol. the spirit of Egypt riding with them into the unknown. At Actium, off the coast of Greece, the two forces met. Octavian's admiral Agrippa commanded a fleet disciplined and cunning. Antony and Cleopatra held numbers, but their ships were heavy, designed more for show than speed. For days the two sides watched one another across the waters, each waiting for the other to strike. Tension filled the air, as if even the sea held its breath. Within their camp, Cleopatra and Antony stood together, gazing across the waves. At night, torches lined the shore, their light shimmering upon the water. In whispered tones, they spoke of strategy, of courage, and of the stakes that stretched beyond themselves. The fate of Egypt, the fate of their children, the fate of empire itself. Imagine Cleopatra in those nights before the battle. She walked along the deck of her barge, the sea breeze carrying the salt of the water, her gaze fixed upon the stars. They were the same constellations she had known in Alexandria, the same eternal lights that had shone over pharaohs before her. To her, they must have seemed both distant and close, reminders that history's eyes were always upon her. As dawn broke on the day of battle, the sea glimmered beneath golden light. Oars struck the water in rhythm, sails caught the wind, and the silence before combat stretched long and heavy. Cleopatra and Antony, united in purpose, braced themselves for the clash that would decide their destiny. As you rest tonight, let your thoughts drift upon those still waters. The horizon is calm, the ship steady, the air filled with expectancy. The Queen of Egypt stands ready, her path bound to the tide of war, her story flowing onward into history's most fateful hour. The morning of Actium dawned with a sky clear and sharp, the sea glimmering like polished glass beneath the rising sun. Along the coast of western Greece, two vast fleets faced one another. On one side stood Octavian, with Agrippa commanding disciplined Roman ships. On the other, Antony and Cleopatra, their vessels adorned with splendor, their banners fluttering proudly in the breeze. The silence before the clash was heavy, as though the world itself held its breath. The fleets moved. Octavian's ships, smaller and swifter, darted across the water with precision. Antony's, though grand and powerful, were slow to respond. Cleopatra's flagship, gleaming with golden carvings and purple sails, held its place at the heart of the Egyptian line. From its deck, she watched as the sea turned into a battlefield of smoke, fire, and iron. The clash of rams against hulls echoed across the waves. Arrows darkened the sky, their tips glinting like sparks before striking wood and flesh. Shouts of commanders mingled with the cries of wounded men, while drums beat a rhythm of war. The Mediterranean, calm only hours before, became a chaos of broken oars and burning sails. Antony fought fiercely. He commanded his legions with courage, rallying ships that faltered, leading from the front with the authority of a seasoned general. Yet Agrippa's tactics wore them down. Roman ships cut through their formation, isolating Antony's vessels, turning advantage into desperation. Then came the moment that would decide history. Cleopatra, watching from her flagship, made a choice that has been debated for centuries. Perhaps she saw the tide turning. Perhaps she acted on prearranged strategy, or perhaps instinct alone guided her. At once, her sails caught the wind, and her fleet of 60 ships broke from the line, heading toward the open sea. Imagine the sight, her purple sails billowing, golden prow cutting through the waves, as her ships fled the chaos. Antony, seeing her departure, abandoned the fight and followed. To his soldiers it was bewildering, to Octavian's men, it was victory handed by fate. The remainder of Antony's fleet, leaderless and shaken, collapsed under Roman assault. The Battle of Actium was lost. The sea that morning had promised glory, but by nightfall it bore only wreckage, drifting wood, and the silence of defeat. Octavian's star rose brighter, while Antony and Cleopatra sailed away, their future uncertain, their legacy already shifting in the minds of those who watched. In the quiet that followed, Cleopatra must have stood on her deck, the wind tangling her hair, the weight of decision heavy upon her. She had chosen survival, for herself, for Antony, and for Egypt. Yet survival carried its own burden, for in retreat lay the seeds of downfall. Antony, though loyal, must have felt the sting of honor wounded. the pride of a general broken. Still, beside Cleopatra he remained, bound by love and destiny. As you drift tonight, imagine the sea after battle. The smoke fades into dusk, waves lap gently against shattered hulls, and the stars return to their eternal watch. Cleopatra's purple sails vanish into the horizon, carrying her story onward. The queen who once dazzled Rome now sails into uncertainty, her path narrowed, her strength tested, but her will unbroken. The waters of Actium lay far behind, yet their shadow followed Cleopatra and Antony as they sailed back toward Egypt. The year was 31 BCE, and the retreat weighed heavily upon them. Once they had stood at the height of power, their fleet dazzling under the Mediterranean sun. Now, they returned with fewer ships, wounded pride, and the silence of defeat echoing through their hearts. In Alexandria, the people greeted them with loyalty, but whispers carried through the city's marble streets. Some spoke of betrayal, others of fate. Cleopatra, ever composed, presented herself to her subjects with calm authority. Dressed in robes of shimmering gold, she walked through the palace halls with her head high, her presence steady, as though no defeat could shake her. To her people, she was still Isis incarnate, the divine protector who would guard Egypt through storms. Antony, however, bore the burden more visibly. The once proud general, who had commanded Rome's legions with thunderous voice and unshakable confidence, now carried the weight of humiliation. He trained with soldiers, planned new strategies, and tried to restore his honor. Yet in the quiet of night, he must have looked upon the Nile with wary eyes, wondering if destiny had already turned against him. Cleopatra, seeing his struggle, offered not reproach but reassurance. She reminded him of the Nile's eternal rhythm, that floods could destroy but also renew. In their palace chambers, she spoke softly of rebuilding, of waiting for the right moment to rise again. She reminded Antony that as long as Egypt stood, their story was not over. Together, they sought to strengthen their rule. Cleopatra opened Egypt's treasuries, funding new armies and fortifying defenses. Ships were repaired, supplies gathered, alliances considered. Banquets returned, though less lavish, carrying a quieter tone of determination. Imagine a hall lit with fewer lamps, the music softer, the laughter subdued. But in Cleopatra's eyes still burned a spark of defiance. Octavian, far away in Rome, wasted no time. He spread word of their retreat, portraying Antony as broken and Cleopatra as manipulative. His propaganda filled the Republic with tales of Eastern decadence, of Antony enthralled by a queen who threatened Roman virtue. Each story tightened Octavian's grip on power, preparing the world for the final clash that was yet to come. Still, in Alexandria, hope was not lost. Cleopatra and Antony found solace in their children, who played in palace gardens, unaware of the storm. Cleopatra Selene and Alexander Helios, bright with youth, represented a future untainted by war. Cleopatra must have gazed upon them often, whispering silent prayers that they might inherit not defeat, but resilience. The city itself seemed to embrace its queen. Festivals still lit the streets, scholars still debated in the library, merchants still filled the harbor with goods from distant lands. Life continued, even under the shadow of Actium. Cleopatra walked among her people with grace, her calm smile concealing the turmoil that pressed against her heart. As night falls, imagine Cleopatra upon the palace balcony. The Nile flows endlessly below, its waters reflecting the glow of torchlight. Antony stands beside her silent, his gaze upon the horizon. Together they face the unknown, wary yet unyielding, bound by love, by loss, and by the determination to endure. The stars above shine as they always have, indifferent yet eternal, bearing witness as history moves slowly toward its inevitable end. The retreat from Actium had left scars, yet in Alexandria the will to endure still lingered. Cleopatra and Antony faced a world closing in upon them, but neither surrendered to despair. Instead, they turned their energy toward rebuilding what had been lost, seeking to restore strength before Octavian's inevitable strike. Antony spent his days among soldiers. He drilled with them in the hot sun, marching across the sands, raising morale with words of courage. Though his pride had been wounded, he sought to prove that the spirit of a general still burned within him. At night, in the palace halls, He spoke with Cleopatra of tactics and alliances. His voice, once filled with thunder, carried wariness, yet Cleopatra's presence steadied him. Cleopatra worked tirelessly as well. She drew upon Egypt's vast wealth, sending envoys across the Mediterranean in search of allies. She wrote letters to kings and rulers, offering trade, friendship, and gold in exchange for support. Yet many wavered, fearful of Rome's growing strength. The world had seen Octavian rise, and few dared to stand against him. Still, Cleopatra pressed forward, determined to weave every thread of hope she could find. The palace of Alexandria remained a center of brilliance. Scholars continued their studies in the great library, priests chanted hymns in the temples, and the harbor thrived with merchants. But beneath the city's surface ran a quiet tension, like the hush before a storm. Citizens knew that Rome's shadow grew longer each day. Still, when Cleopatra appeared among them, draped in silk, her crown gleaming, they cheered, taking comfort in her presence. She embodied resilience, a living reminder that Egypt had endured for centuries and would not bow easily. Antony, though bolstered by her, wrestled with doubt. He remembered Rome, its forum, its legions, its traditions, and knew that Octavian commanded them now. He feared that his legacy would be one of betrayal, whispered in the streets as the man who abandoned Rome for a queen. Cleopatra, sensing his turmoil, reminded him that history was written not only by the victors, but by the enduring memory of those who lived boldly. Together, they would face what came, and together they would be remembered. In 30 BCE, Octavian prepared for his final march upon Egypt. His armies gathered, vast and disciplined, his fleet repaired and ready. In Rome, he declared that Antony and Cleopatra were enemies of the Republic, casting them as obstacles to peace. Propaganda filled the air, painting Cleopatra as a foreign temptress and Antony as a fallen hero. The stage was set for the last act of their story. Imagine Cleopatra in these final days of preparation. She stands upon the balcony of her palace, gazing across the Nile as ships gather in the harbor. Her children play in the gardens below, their laughter faint but comforting. Antony joins her, his armor polished, his gaze firm though shadowed with doubt. They share a quiet moment, hands clasped, eyes lifted to the horizon where Octavian's legions will one day appear. The night in Alexandria is calm, lanterns flickering in the warm breeze, stars shining high above the desert. Yet beneath the beauty, the weight of destiny presses close. Cleopatra and Antony know that the end approaches, but neither turns away. The river flows, eternal and serene, as if whispering that even in defeat, their story will endure beyond the tides of time. The horizon darkened with the march of Rome. By the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian's armies advanced steadily toward Egypt, their banners carried high, their discipline unbroken. To the people of Alexandria, the threat grew real with every passing day. Rumors spread through the city's markets and along the harbor. Voices hushed yet urgent: Rome was coming. Within the palace, Cleopatra and Antony prepared as best they could. Cleopatra opened her treasuries once more, paying soldiers and equipping ships. Gold was melted into coin, jewels into weapons, wealth transformed into defense. She walked among her people, her robes flowing like river water, her crown gleaming in the sunlight. To them she spoke not of fear but of resilience. Her words steady: Egypt had endured before, and it would endure again. Antony, though worn by past defeats, rallied his remaining forces. He donned his armor, marched among his legions, and lifted their spirits with the fire of his voice. He promised them honor, he promised them one last stand for dignity. Though he must have felt the burden of futility, Antony fought to the end to embody the general he had once been. His men, loyal still, shouted his name, their trust binding them to his cause. Yet in the quiet of night, both he and Cleopatra must have felt the press of fate. In her private chambers, Cleopatra sat with her children, their young faces glowing in the lamplight. She whispered promises of protection, though her heart knew the uncertainty of tomorrow. She spoke softly to Caesarion, her eldest, telling him of the Nile, of his father Caesar, of the destiny he carried in his blood. These moments, fragile and fleeting, were her truest treasures. As Octavian drew closer, Cleopatra considered her options. Envoys were sent, offers whispered, letters dispatched. Some suggested she surrender Antony to save herself and her children. But Cleopatra, bound by loyalty and love, refused to betray him. Instead, she sought a way to negotiate, to preserve Egypt even in the face of overwhelming might. Her mind balanced possibilities like weights upon a scale, searching for a path that might spare her kingdom. The city of Alexandria braced itself. Ships lined the harbor, their sails furled, their decks armed. Soldiers stood guard upon the walls, their eyes fixed on the desert beyond. Merchants hid their goods, families prayed in temples, priests lit incense to the gods. The air was thick with tension, as if the very stones of the city could sense the approaching storm. Antony, restless, trained with his men until dusk. Cleopatra watched from afar, her gaze steady, her heart heavy. She had chosen her path long ago, yet the weight of its cost now pressed upon her. She knew that Octavian's arrival would not only decide their fate, but echo through the centuries. Still, she did not falter. To her people, she remained Isis incarnate, unbroken and serene. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine Alexandria on the eve of Rome's arrival. The harbor glimmers under starlight, torches flicker upon the walls, and the Nile flows silent and endless. Within the palace, Cleopatra sits beside Antony, their hands entwined, their silence filled with all the words that cannot be spoken. The night is calm, but history waits at the gates, ready to turn the page upon their story. The summer sun burned bright over Alexandria as Octavian's legions finally reached the city. Dust rose behind their march, a steady rhythm of boots and shields carrying the power of Rome to the gates of Egypt. To the citizens who watched from rooftops and harbor walls, the sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The long shadow of empire had arrived, and with it, the fate of Cleopatra and Antony drew near. Inside the palace, Cleopatra prepared with unwavering composure. She adorned herself in regal robes, jewels shimmering upon her brow, and moved through the marble halls with calm authority. To her attendants, she gave careful instructions: protect the children, guard the treasures, honor the gods. To her people she remained serene, even as fear rippled beneath the surface of the city. Antony, however, burned with desperation. The proud general could not bear the thought of surrender. He gathered his remaining soldiers and vowed to fight, to defend Alexandria with the last of his strength. On the city's outskirts, skirmishes flared. Roman legions clashed with Antony's dwindling forces, the desert winds carrying the cries of battle. Yet each clash pushed Antony's men back, for Octavian's armies were too many, too disciplined, too relentless. Still, Cleopatra stood beside him. She watched from palace terraces as the horizon filled with dust and iron, the banners of Rome advancing closer each day. At night, she lit incense in the temples, praying to Isis for guidance, for courage, for protection of her children. She whispered to Caesarion, telling him of his father's greatness, urging him to remember his lineage, though she must have known how fragile his future was becoming. In the city, tension grew unbearable. Merchants shuttered their shops, scholars whispered of omens, priests recited prayers at dawn and dusk. Families clung to one another as the sound of Roman horns echoed closer. And yet, within the palace walls, Cleopatra's voice remained steady. She spoke to her attendants with calm determination, telling them that Egypt had endured conquerors before, and that its spirit would never be broken. Antony's resolve faltered as the noose tightened. He fought bravely, but with each defeat his hope diminished. His men, though loyal, dwindled in number, their strength sapped by Rome's might. In quiet moments, Antony must have looked at Cleopatra with sorrow, knowing that the world they had dreamed of was slipping away. She, in turn, met his gaze not with reproach but with strength, reminding him that even in loss, dignity remained. At last, Octavian's forces reached Alexandria's gates. The city, brilliant jewel of the Mediterranean, braced for its fall. From the harbor, ships lay silent. From the walls, soldiers held their posts with trembling hands. The people waited in silence, hearts heavy with the weight of destiny. Cleopatra, standing upon a palace balcony, looked out over the Nile, its waters glowing in the fading sun. She knew the final chapter had begun. As you rest tonight, imagine Alexandria at this moment, a city poised on the edge of history, its streets hushed, its skies heavy with anticipation. In the palace, Cleopatra and Antony stand side by side, their hands clasped in quiet solidarity. Beyond the walls, Rome presses forward, unstoppable as the tide. The night is still, the stars eternal, and destiny approaches with steady, unyielding steps. The walls of Alexandria quivered beneath the steady march of Rome. By the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian's forces encircled the city, their banners high, their horns echoing across the desert air. The citizens, once proud of their brilliant capital, now whispered prayers in crowded temples. The jewel of the Mediterranean was no longer untouchable. It stood trembling before conquest. Antony, though beaten at Actium, refused surrender. He rallied what remained of his legions, his voice still booming across the squares where soldiers gathered. Imagine him upon his horse, armor battered but gleaming, shouting promises of victory, or at least of honor. His men, though wary, followed him still, bound by loyalty to the general who had led them through so many triumphs. Yet deep within, Antony knew the tide could not be turned. Cleopatra ruled from the palace with unbroken composure. Draped in gold and linen, she walked through marble halls giving calm instructions to her attendants. "Protect the children, guard the treasures, honor the gods," she would say. To her people she appeared radiant and strong, embodying Isis, the divine mother of Egypt. Even as the city faltered, her presence steadied hearts, her poise a living shield against despair. The battles raged at the city's gates. Antony's forces fought bravely, holding the walls as long as they could, but Octavian's legions pressed forward with relentless discipline. One by one, the defenses gave way. The desert winds carried the cries of battle into the heart of Alexandria. Fires glowed in the distance, smoke rising into a sky that had once been serene. Inside the palace, Cleopatra prepared for the worst. She summoned her children, their young faces lit by torchlight. She whispered stories of the Nile, of the gods who guided Egypt, of the legacy that flowed in their blood. To Caesarion, her eldest, she spoke of his father Julius Caesar, of the greatness he must remember even in times of peril. These moments, fragile and fleeting, were her true treasures. Antony's honor weighed heavily upon him. To lose Rome was one wound, to lose Egypt and Cleopatra was another. He fought not only against Octavian's legions, but against the shame of defeat. When he returned from battle, his armor scarred, his spirit heavy, Cleopatra welcomed him not with reproach, but with quiet strength. In her gaze he found dignity, even as the world crumbled around them. The city braced for its fall. The library stood silent, scrolls untouched. The harbor, once alive with ships from every corner of the world, now lay trapped by Rome's fleet. Families huddled in temples, merchants hid their goods, priests lifted prayers with trembling voices. The rhythm of daily life slowed, replaced by the hush of anticipation, the knowledge that history itself stood at Alexandria's gates. As the sun set one evening, Cleopatra stood upon her balcony, the Nile glowing gold in the fading light. Antony stood beside her silent, his hand clasping hers. Neither spoke, for words were powerless before the weight of destiny. They gazed toward the horizon, where Roman banners rose higher with each passing day. As you drift into rest, picture that scene: Alexandria bathed in twilight, the Nile flowing steady, the city waiting in silence. Within the palace, two figures stand side by side, bound by love, loss, and the unyielding march of history. The night is calm, the stars eternal, but the fate of Egypt's last queen draws ever closer. The days after Alexandria's walls opened to Rome carried a silence heavier than battle. Standards of the legions fluttered above marble roofs, and the steady tramp of foreign boots turned the streets into corridors of echoing fate. Within the palace, lamps burned low through long hours, and attendants spoke in whispers. Cleopatra moved with composed grace among her people, yet every hallway seemed to lead toward a single, narrowing end. For Antony, the wait was different. Defeat cut him keenly, but the deeper wound was the humiliation he knew awaited him. To be shown to the crowds in a victor's procession, chained and mocked beneath Roman laurels, was a destiny he could not accept. He had lived by the honor of a soldier. He could not imagine living without it. Those close to him saw the change. The once thunderous voice softened, the confident step slowed, and behind his eyes a private reckoning gathered like dusk. Rumor, swift and cruel, reached him in that dim twilight. Cleopatra had ended her life rather than fall to Octavian. Whether born of confusion or malice, the report pierced him. In despair, Antony chose his own exit from the stage of history. The act itself need not be described. It is enough to know that when he fell, honor and grief were bound together, and that the world he had tried to hold with iron hands slipped away like water. Word raced to Cleopatra. She had not died, she had been planning, pleading, arranging, still searching for a path through the tightening maze. When she heard what Antony had done, a cry passed through the palace like a sudden wind. Servants carried the wounded general to her refuge, a quiet chamber perfumed with incense and shadowed by woven screens. There, beneath the muted glimmer of lamp flame, she received him into her arms. Imagine the stillness, a queen in linen, the faint shine of gold at her brow, Antony's head cradled against her. No proclamations, no speeches, only low, human words that history rarely records. She told him that he was not alone. He told her that she was more than fortune or defeat. Around them, the old sounds of the palace. Footsteps, hushed sobs, the far murmur of the river. Went on as if the world wished to soften the edge of parting. When his breath at last grew quiet and was gone, Cleopatra pressed her forehead to his and remained very still, a figure carved from sorrow and resolve. Grief did not blunt her purpose. She ensured that Antony would be honored, as far as circumstances allowed, and then turned to what remained: her children, her city, her name. She knew Octavian would seek a living trophy, a queen paraded under Roman triumphal arches. She also knew that dignity could be guarded, even when power could not. Messages went out to loyal hands, treasures were secured, the young were gathered close. In every gesture, Cleopatra chose the poise of a ruler, not the panic of a captive. Octavian entered the city with measured calm, his victory precise and cool. He granted audiences in carefully staged rooms, letting the weight of Rome speak through silence as much as through words. Cleopatra met him once. Veiled, composed, deliberate, she offered Egypt's wealth, pleaded for the safety of her children, and tested the boundaries of mercy. Octavian listened unrateable. He admired order, not splendor; obedience, not spectacle. Whatever kindness his replies contained, they were edged with purpose. Afterward, Cleopatra was confined to her apartments, rooms that had once echoed with music and philosophy, now kept in a hush broken only by the soft tread of guards. She walked among familiar tapestries and stone, touching pillars as if they were old companions. On a low table lay maps of the world she had tried to shape. Nearby, a small casket of letters and seals. Farther off, the toys of her children. The Queen of Egypt considered every remaining path and weighed the cost of each. Night deepened. From the balcony, the Nile drifted past like a black ribbon stitched with starlight. The city that had been her stage lay quiet, its harbor stilled, its scholars and merchants turned inward, waiting. In the distance, a trumpet sounded and faded. Cleopatra closed her eyes and listened to the river's slow breath. Tomorrow would ask for one last act, one chosen by her, not imposed upon her, so that the story of the queen and the soldier would end as it had been lived, with courage, with ceremony, and with the calm of one who refuses to surrender what cannot be taken. Rest now with that image, a solitary figure in lamplight, the desert night cool around her, the river eternal below. The moment holds, gentle and unhurried, as if time itself wished to soften its edge. History waits at the threshold, and Cleopatra, last of the pharaohs, gathers herself to step through. The city of Alexandria no longer belonged to its queen. Roman standards flew across the walls, and the harbor was filled with Octavian's fleet. Yet within the marble palace, Cleopatra still held her court, determined that her final days would be lived with dignity. Her attendants moved quietly through the golden halls, their footsteps echoing like whispers of an era drawing to its close. Octavian had sent envoys. Their words were polite but edged with steel surrender. live under Roman mercy, or be paraded in chains before the people of Rome. Cleopatra listened, her face calm, her eyes unreadable. She knew too well what had happened to defeated monarchs, humiliated, mocked, displayed as spoils of war. For her, such a fate was worse than death. She began to prepare. Sacredly, she tested poisons with her most loyal servants, weighing their effects with the precision of a scholar. Accounts speak of baskets of figs brought to her chambers, some hiding deadly serpents, others containing flasks of venom. She wanted certainty. If she must leave life, she would choose her moment and her manner. Her children were never far from her thoughts. She watched Caesarion, tall and solemn, moving through the palace with the quiet bearing of his father Julius Caesar. To him, she whispered guidance, urging him to remember his heritage. The younger children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and little Ptolemy Philadelphus, clung to her robes, innocent of the storm closing in. To their mother, they were both a source of comfort and of unbearable sorrow. At night, Cleopatra stood before the great mirrors of her chamber, clad in silks and jewels, as though she were still the sovereign of an unbroken realm. She studied her reflection not with vanity, but with resolve. "If Rome takes me," she thought, "they shall not take me diminished." Her beauty, her intellect, her legend, these were hers alone, and she would wield them until the very last hour. Octavian, ever cautious, sought to capture her alive. He knew the power of spectacle. The Queen of Egypt led in chains would be the crowning jewel of his triumph in Rome. He instructed his men to guard her carefully, to prevent any attempt at escape or death. But Cleopatra was not a woman to be contained by another's will. She had defied generals and kings. She would not yield her final act to a conqueror. Within the palace walls, time slowed. The air grew heavy with incense, with whispered prayers, with the weight of destiny. Servants moved in shadows, bringing scrolls, treasures, and the last offerings of loyalty. Musicians played soft laments in the courtyards, their notes drifting like sighs into the evening air. And Cleopatra herself walked among her people. She entered the temple of Isis one final time, veiled and radiant, laying offerings before the goddess she had embodied in life. Those who saw her swore she shone with a light beyond mortal beauty, as if divinity itself walked among them. To her priests and subjects, she was not a queen defeated, but a living symbol of Egypt's soul. As the sun sank, she returned to her chambers, where Antony's memory lingered in every corner. She touched the walls as if they carried his voice, and for a fleeting moment, the pain of loss gave way to calm acceptance. She would soon join him, not as a captive, but as a sovereign choosing her own fate. Imagine her there, dear listener, the Queen of the Nile, standing tall in her twilight. Outside, the Roman world awaited to claim her. Inside, she prepared her last, unbreakable answer. The torches flickered, the night deepened, and Cleopatra's legend drew closer to its eternal hour. The final dawn rose over Alexandria with a stillness that seemed almost merciful. The harbor lay quiet. Roman ships anchored in rows, their sails furled like wings at rest. Inside the palace, lamps burned low as Cleopatra prepared for the act that would define her forever. She had faced Octavian's demands, listened to his measured words, and seen the future he intended for her: humiliation in Rome, chains upon her wrists, and the spectacle of Egypt's queen displayed as a spoil of conquest. Such a fate she would never allow. Her attendants moved softly, loyal women who had remained with her through every storm. Together they arranged the chamber with care. Perfumed oils filled the air, garlands of flowers hung upon the walls, and golden vessels gleamed in the lamplight. It was not a scene of defeat, but of ritual. Cleopatra wished her end to echo the majesty of her life, to be remembered not as a prisoner, but as a queen who chose her own hour. Among the baskets carried into the chamber was one filled with figs. Hidden within, according to legend, coiled the asp, the serpent sacred to Egypt, symbol of death and rebirth. Some accounts speak of venom prepared in small jars, others of hidden poisons mixed with ointments. Whatever the truth, Cleopatra had ensured that no Roman hand would dictate her final breath. Before the act, she turned to her children. Caesarion had already been sent away, urged to seek safety though fate would deny him refuge. Her younger ones, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were kept close under guard. She embraced them one last time, whispering prayers that the gods would guard them where she no longer could. For all her strength, it was this parting that must have pierced her heart deepest. Then came the quiet moment. Draped in royal linen, her crown set lightly upon her brow, Cleopatra reclined upon a golden couch. She held the asp, or perhaps a vial, with hands steady as stone. Her gaze lifted not to her attendants but to the ceiling painted with stars, a reminder of the heavens that guided pharaohs before her. With calm breath, she chose release. The poison entered her veins, swift and silent. Her face softened, her body grew still, and the Queen of Egypt passed into eternity. Her attendants, faithful to the end, followed her path, unwilling to outlive their mistress. Together they lay in silence as the torches flickered low. When Octavian's soldiers broke through the doors, they found not a captive queen to parade, but a sovereign who had denied him his triumph. Cleopatra's beauty lingered in death, her body adorned, her dignity untouched. For Octavian, victory was complete, though bittersweet. Egypt fell into Roman hands, its treasures flowing into his coffers, its throne empty at last. Yet Cleopatra's final act denied him the spectacle he most desired. She became not a trophy, but a legend, one whose story would outshine even the empire that claimed her land. Imagine the scene as night descends, the palace quiet, the Nile flowing in eternal rhythm, and within the chamber, the last pharaoh lying serene upon her couch. Outside, Rome celebrated conquest. Inside, Egypt's queen had written her own ending, one that even Rome could not rewrite. As you rest tonight, hold this image gently, Cleopatra, sovereign to her last breath, unbroken by defeat, radiant even in death. The torches fade, the waters murmur, and history itself bows before her courage. The queen was gone. Cleopatra, last of the pharaohs, had chosen her own hour and slipped into eternity. Yet her death was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of her legend, and the turning of a great page in history. For with her passing, Egypt ceased to be a sovereign kingdom. It became a jewel in Rome's crown, a province absorbed into an empire that stretched farther than any before. Octavian, soon to be called Augustus, walked through the palace that had once echoed with Cleopatra's voice. The golden halls now lay silent, the scent of incense still lingering from her final hours. He found no queen to parade in triumph, no captive to display in chains. Cleopatra had denied him that, and though he held Egypt in his grasp, he must have known he could never hold her spirit. The treasures of Alexandria were gathered swiftly. Gold, ivory, and spices flowed into Roman coffers. Scrolls from the library, statues from temples, and works of art from the palace were carried off as tokens of conquest. Rome rejoiced, yet behind the celebration lay an unspoken truth. A woman had outwitted the conqueror in her final act, leaving him victory, but not glory. And what of her children? Caesarion, her eldest, the son of Julius Caesar, tried to flee. He carried the hope of two worlds within him. The blood of Rome and Egypt joined. Yet Octavian's men found him before he could escape, and his young life ended quietly, far from the throne that might have been his. The younger children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and little Ptolemy Philadelphus, were spared. Taken to Rome, they marched in Octavian's triumph, not as rulers but as symbols of submission. Cleopatra Selene, in time, would marry into another royal house, carrying a fragment of her mother's legacy into distant lands. In Egypt, the people mourned in silence. Priests lit lamps in the temples, chanting hymns to Isis for the soul of their queen. Fishermen along the Nile whispered her name as they cast their nets. Merchants in the marketplace spoke of her beauty and cunning, and mothers told their children of the sovereign who had lived and died as Egypt's defender. Though Rome claimed her kingdom, Cleopatra remained Egypt in their hearts. Imagine Alexandria in the days after her passing. The harbor filled with Roman banners, soldiers patrolled the streets, yet the city's spirit lingered. The palace gardens, heavy with jasmine, still carried the memory of her footsteps. The great columns of temples still seemed to hold her presence. Even the Nile, flowing endlessly as it always had, seemed touched by her memory. For Octavian, the conquest of Egypt was the final step to absolute power. With its wealth and grain, Rome could feed its people and secure its empire. Soon he would take the title Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, and the world would enter a new age. Yet even in triumph, he could not erase Cleopatra's defiance. Her story would be told for centuries, not as that of a defeated queen, but as a woman who shaped her own ending. As night falls, imagine the soft glow of torches upon Alexandria's palace. The halls are silent, the throne empty, but the air still hums with memory. Cleopatra's reign has ended, but her legend has only begun. In the hush of history, her name endures, shining as brightly as the stars above the Nile. The fall of Cleopatra and the capture of Alexandria did not end only a dynasty, it marked the close of an age. With Egypt now under Roman control, Octavian returned home carrying more than treasure, he carried the weight of destiny. Soon he would be called Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, and the world would step quietly into a new era. Imagine the voyage back to Rome. Ships filled with gold and grain sailed across the Mediterranean, their sails glowing in the sun. Soldiers sang of victory, priests offered prayers, and envoys whispered of a man who would soon rule not as a consul, but as a monarch in all but name. Behind them, Egypt, ancient land of gods and pharaohs, was left under Roman administration, its independence extinguished. For the Egyptian people, life changed slowly at first. The Nile still rose and fell, bringing fertility to the land. Farmers still sowed their seeds, fishermen still cast their nets, and priests still lit lamps in temples. But above it all now flew Roman standards. Taxes were collected in the name of Rome, governors issued commands from Caesar's authority, and Egypt's wealth was sent northward to sustain the empire. The queen who had once walked among them, radiant and unyielding, was gone, and in her place came the distant voice of Rome. In Rome itself, Octavian's triumph was celebrated with unmatched splendor. Crowds filled the forum, cheering as the spoils of Egypt were paraded through the streets. Statues, gold, and exotic animals dazzled the people, but Cleopatra herself was absent. She had denied them that spectacle, and in her absence, whispers lingered. Some admired her courage, others condemned her pride, but all remembered her. In death, she was more powerful as legend than she had ever been in life. Augustus understood this. He shaped his victory carefully, presenting himself not merely as conqueror, but as the man who had brought peace to Rome after decades of civil war. The Senate granted him titles, honors, and authority beyond any before him. The Republic, in truth, had ended, though in name it survived. Rome was now an empire, and Egypt its most prized possession. Back in Alexandria, the great city adjusted to its new role. Scholars still studied in the library, though under Roman oversight. Merchants continued to fill the harbor with goods, though tariffs flowed to Rome. The palace stood silent, its chambers once alive with Cleopatra's voice now echoing with emptiness. And yet, her memory endured. In markets and homes her story was told, not as failure, but as devotion to Egypt, as dignity in the face of overwhelming power. Her children's lives unfolded under Roman watch. Caesarion was gone, but Cleopatra Selene carried her mother's legacy into a new land when she married King Juba of Mauritania. In distant Africa, her descendants would rule, and her name would echo across the seas. Even in exile, her bloodline found a way to survive, carrying a spark of Egypt's last queen far beyond the Nile. As you rest tonight, picture the Mediterranean under starlight, ships drifting across its waters, carrying Egypt's treasures to Rome. Picture the Nile flowing quietly, its banks unchanged, its people whispering prayers to Isis as they had for centuries. The age of pharaohs had ended, but the rhythm of the river remained eternal. Cleopatra's life had closed a chapter, and Augustus's rise had begun another. History moves onward like water, endlessly, quietly, forever. Though Cleopatra's reign ended with her death, her presence did not vanish. Instead, it spread, woven into memory, myth, and story. The queen who had lived in marble halls and sailed in golden barges now drifted into the currents of legend. From the shores of the Nile to the libraries of Rome, her name lingered like perfume in the air, subtle yet enduring. In Alexandria, whispers of her courage passed from one generation to the next. Mothers told their children of the queen who had stood against Rome, who had faced defeat yet chosen dignity. Priests in quiet temples spoke of her as Isis reborn, a mortal who had carried divinity into human form. For the people of Egypt, she was not merely a ruler lost. She was a spirit who had embodied their land. In Rome, her memory was shaped differently. Poets and historians wrote of her beauty, her intelligence, and her defiance. Some, loyal to Octavian, painted her as a temptress who had ensnared Antony, a warning against the power of foreign queens. Others, captivated by her story, described her as a figure of tragic grandeur, a woman who matched emperors in courage and outshone them in legend. Even among those who sought to diminish her, she remained unforgettable. Imagine scrolls unfurled in Roman villas, words describing Cleopatra's banquet halls glittering with gold, her barge gliding across the Tiber, her voice commanding with gentle authority. Around firelit gatherings, her name was spoken with wonder, curiosity, and sometimes fear. Each retelling reshaped her, until she was no longer only a queen of Egypt, but a symbol of power, beauty, and fate. Artists too found inspiration. Painters traced her likeness upon walls, sculptors carved her features in marble, playwrights reimagined her final days with drama and sorrow. Over centuries, her story grew not smaller but larger, embroidered by imagination. Cleopatra became not just a figure of history but of art, a muse who stirred creativity across cultures. In Egypt, her monuments stood as silent witnesses. Temples that had once heard her prayers still rose against the desert sky. Coins bearing her profile circulated long after her death, small discs of silver and bronze carrying her gaze into the hands of common people. Even when Rome ruled, her face lingered in daily life, a quiet reminder of the queen who had once walked among them. As centuries passed, her legend crossed borders and languages. Greek historians, Roman poets, Arab scholars, all preserved fragments of her story. Some spoke of her as a goddess, others as a schemer, but all agreed that she was extraordinary. Her story could not be contained by time or place. It stretched outward, as wide as the Nile itself. For those who listened, Cleopatra's life became more than history. It became a meditation on choice, on power, on the fleeting yet eternal nature of dignity. She taught that even in defeat there is grace, and that even when empires fall, memory endures. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine a candle burning in a scholar's study, the flicker of its flame illuminating a scroll that bears her name. Outside, the night is quiet, stars glimmering over the desert as they did in her time. Cleopatra's story flows onward, not bound by walls or kingdoms, but carried forever in the imagination of those who speak it. In the decades after Cleopatra's death, her shadow lingered in Rome, not only as legend but as weapon. Octavian, now Augustus, the first emperor, understood the value of memory. He shaped her image carefully, weaving her into the fabric of his triumph, not as a queen who had chosen dignity, but as a symbol of what he had defeated. Imagine the streets of Rome during his reign. Marble arches rose to celebrate victory, inscriptions praised the emperor's conquest of Egypt, and poets recited verses that told of a foreign queen who had threatened the republic. In this narrative, Cleopatra became the embodiment of danger. Exotic, alluring, and destructive, Antony's downfall was attributed not to his own choices, but to her influence. Rome had not been defeated by a general's failure. It had been tested by the spell of a queen, and Augustus had broken that spell. The propaganda was effective. In forums and marketplaces, her name was whispered as caution. Mothers warned sons not to be swayed by beauty. Senators spoke of her as a reminder of foreign temptation. Cleopatra's life was transformed from history into lesson. Her choices reframed to glorify Augustus's victory. Where once she had been a sovereign shaping her own destiny, now she was cast as an antagonist in Rome's story of triumph. And yet, beneath the sharp edges of propaganda, fascination persisted. Artists painted her likeness, poets returned to her tale, and philosophers debated the nature of her influence. Even in Augustus's carefully crafted vision, Cleopatra could not be diminished entirely. The more Rome condemned her, the more it revealed its obsession. In Egypt, Augustus allowed the temples to continue their rituals, but Cleopatra's memory was hushed. Her name was not carved with reverence into new stone. Instead, Rome placed governors, collected taxes, and filled granaries with the wealth of the Nile. Egypt became the personal possession of the emperor, its riches feeding the heart of the empire. Still, the people remembered. In markets and fields, her name lingered softly, spoken in songs and prayers. Her image carried quietly in coins that bore her profile. Cleopatra's story thus lived on in two forms: in Rome, as cautionary tale; in Egypt, as quiet devotion. Both versions carried truth, yet neither held her completely. History itself seemed divided, as if the queen had stretched beyond the grasp of either empire. Picture Augustus in his golden halls, draped in purple, receiving homage from senators and envoys. Around him, statues and scrolls celebrated his conquest of the East. And yet, in every triumph, Cleopatra's shadow was there. He could not erase her, he could only frame her. The Queen of Egypt had become the mirror in which Rome measured its own strength. As you rest tonight, imagine the Roman Forum at dusk, its marble glowing in fading light, voices rising as poets recite verses of empire. Among the words, Cleopatra's name drifts like a note of sorrow, both feared and admired. She lives on not as a captive but as an idea, shaped, reshaped, yet never silenced. As the decades turned into centuries, Cleopatra's story slipped further from the realm of politics and deeper into the realm of legend. The Rome that had once feared her influence grew accustomed to empire, and her image, once sharpened by Augustus's propaganda, began to soften into myth. She was no longer only the foreign queen who threatened Rome, she became the tragic heroine of plays, poems, and whispered tales. Imagine a Roman household in the 1st century CE. Oil lamps glow upon frescoed walls, and a family gathers as a storyteller recounts the lives of rulers past. When he speaks of Cleopatra, his voice lowers into awe. He tells of her barge with sails of purple, of feasts that lasted till dawn, of her wit that could match philosophers, and of her death that defied Rome itself. The listeners, though living under Roman rule, lean forward in fascination, caught by the drama of her life. Poets preserved her memory in verse. They wrote of her beauty that shimmered like the Nile at sunset, of her voice that carried wisdom and charm, of her gaze that could sway even emperors. Some condemned her as Augustus had intended, yet others, more quietly, admired her courage. For the Roman imagination, Cleopatra became a mirror of longing, a figure of power and passion who existed both as warning and as wonder. On stage, playwrights brought her to life. Actors, draped in silks and golden crowns, spoke her words with dramatic flourish, reenacting her final moments with serpents, poison, or daggers, depending on the tale. The audience gasped, wept, and applauded, their hearts stirred by the tragedy of a queen who chose death over chains. Whether villainous or heroine, Cleopatra could not be ignored. In Egypt, her presence lingered differently. Farmers still left offerings at temples to Isis, whispering prayers that carried echoes of their queen. Merchants carved her likeness into amulets, carrying them as charms for fortune. To them, she was not a cautionary tale but a guardian spirit, a reminder that Egypt's soul endured even beneath Roman rule. Centuries after her passing, Cleopatra's name traveled beyond Rome and Egypt. In Greece, scholars wrote of her in histories, weaving fact with embellishment. In the lands of the East, traders repeated tales of her splendor, until her image stretched into far-off cultures. Each retelling added new colors, new shapes, transforming her into something greater than life, a legend that transcended borders. And yet, through all the stories, the truth of Cleopatra remained elusive. Was she conqueror or victim, enchantress or strategist, goddess or mortal? The ambiguity was part of her power. For each generation, she became what they most needed her to be: a warning, a muse, a dream. As night falls, imagine an ancient theater lit by torches. The crowd, hushed as an actor in a golden headdress raises her arms and speaks Cleopatra's final words. The air trembles with silence, then erupts with applause. The queen lives again, not in marble halls or palace gardens, but in memory, in art, in the endless imagination of humankind. Her throne was gone, her empire absorbed, yet her story endured, alive, unbroken, flowing like the Nile itself into the vast sea of history. As centuries passed and Rome itself transformed, Cleopatra's story continued to ripple outward, carried into the imagination of new cultures. In the Middle Ages, long after the Library of Alexandria had dimmed and the empire of Augustus had faded, her image lived on in manuscripts, chronicles, and whispered tales. She was remembered not only as a queen, but as a symbol, reshaped again and again according to the eyes that beheld her. In the Arab world, scholars and poets preserved her as more than a monarch of beauty. To them, Cleopatra, often called Cleopatra al-Hakima, the wise, was celebrated as a woman of learning. They spoke of her as a philosopher, a healer, even an alchemist. Manuscripts described her as one who studied the stars, mixed potions, and sought the hidden truths of nature. In these retellings, she was less the tragic lover of Antony or Caesar, and more a guardian of knowledge, a sovereign whose intellect matched her crown. In Byzantine chronicles, her memory carried the echoes of Rome's old propaganda, yet softened by distance. Writers described her with caution, as the queen who had ensnared mighty generals, but also with awe, recognizing her as a ruler who stood fearlessly against the greatest power of her age. For them, she was a reminder of the fragile line between power and downfall, of the way ambition could dazzle and destroy. In medieval Europe, where ancient tales were often retold through the lens of morality, Cleopatra's story shifted yet again. Some saw her as a cautionary figure, a symbol of passion unchecked, of rulers brought low by desire. Yet others wove her into compendiums of famous women, placing her beside queens and heroines who embodied courage. Illuminated manuscripts showed her seated upon a throne, crowned and majestic, or reclining upon a couch at the moment of her fateful end. Each image told as much about the storyteller as it did about the queen herself. Imagine a scribe in a candlelit chamber, copying her name onto parchment. The glow of the flame flickers upon the ink, while outside, night settles upon a monastery cloister. In that quiet space, Cleopatra lives again, not as a queen in Alexandria, but as a figure of memory in faraway lands. Her legend also traveled through travelers and merchants, along the trade routes that linked east and west. Her name was spoken beside those of Alexander and Caesar. Caravan songs told of her beauty, while scholars debated her wisdom. To some, she was enchantress, to others, sage. The ambiguity made her story enduring, capable of being reshaped to suit every listener. Even in lands that had never known the Nile, Cleopatra became a presence. She appeared in medieval romances, sometimes as a queen of sorcery, sometimes as a figure of tragic love. Her barge with purple sails drifted into the imagination of Europe. Her serpent's bite became a symbol of fate chosen rather than imposed. As you rest tonight, imagine a medieval library, shelves lined with parchment scrolls and leather-bound tomes. A scholar pauses at a page where her name appears, written in careful script. The room is quiet, the candle burns low, and outside, stars glitter above a distant land. Cleopatra, once queen of Egypt, now lives not in palaces, but in ink, in memory, and in the endless retellings of those who could not forget her. The Renaissance brought with it a rebirth not only of art and science, but also of memory. As Europe turned once more to the classical past, Cleopatra's image rose anew from the pages of ancient histories. No longer confined to the margins of medieval chronicles, she stepped into paintings, plays, and poems, her story reshaped for an age that delighted in drama, passion, and grandeur. In Italy, where scholars rediscovered Greek and Roman texts, Cleopatra appeared in the works of humanists who sought to link their world with antiquity. Writers debated her choices, her wisdom, her downfall. Was she a victim of Rome's ambition, or the architect of her own fate? To some, she was the epitome of dangerous love. To others, a figure of heroic resistance. Her ambiguity fascinated minds that delighted in the complexity of human nature. Artists captured her in vibrant colors. Imagine frescoes and canvases where Cleopatra reclines upon a gilded couch, attendants surrounding her, a serpent poised upon her arm. The room glows with candlelight, silk shimmer, and her face is painted serene rather than fearful. These images did not merely retell history, they dramatized it, turning her final act into a performance for eternity. In France and England, poets and dramatists embraced her story. She entered the stage as a tragic heroine, her love for Antony and her defiance against Octavian played out in passionate words. Audiences sat in candlelit theaters, watching actresses draped in flowing robes speak her lines with sorrow and majesty. Her death became not a footnote of history, but the climax of a romance between two empires. The fascination with her grandeur extended beyond her love story. Renaissance thinkers also admired her intellect. Some texts portrayed her as a philosopher queen, skilled in languages, versed in medicine, and curious about the stars. In these retellings, Cleopatra was not only beautiful but wise, embodying the Renaissance ideal of the ruler who blended knowledge with power. Her barge, with its purple sails, became a symbol of spectacle, described in glowing detail by poets who imagined its arrival upon European rivers. To Renaissance eyes, Cleopatra's world represented both the wealth of the East and the mystery of antiquity, a blending of exotic wonder and tragic dignity. Picture a Florentine painter working late into the night, brush in hand, as he adds the final touches to Cleopatra's face upon the canvas. Her eyes gaze upward, calm and luminous, her lips parted as though whispering farewell. In the dim studio light, the Queen of Egypt is reborn, not in Alexandria, but in Renaissance imagination, alive again in pigment and gold. By the end of the Renaissance, Cleopatra had become an icon of tragedy and passion, a muse for those who sought to capture the depth of human emotion. She was not forgotten as queen, but remembered most vividly as a woman who lived and died with extraordinary intensity. Her story no longer belonged to Rome or Egypt alone. It belonged to the world of art, where she would forever inspire. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine the echo of Renaissance theaters, the flicker of stage candles, and the brushstrokes upon canvases that sought to hold her beauty. Cleopatra lives there still, a figure eternal, reborn with each retelling, her story flowing onward into the dreams of new centuries. The Renaissance had rekindled Cleopatra's image, but it was the pen of William Shakespeare that gave her a voice that would echo through centuries. In the early 17th century, Antony and Cleopatra appeared on the stage, transforming the queen into one of literature's most enduring figures. Through Shakespeare, her life was not only remembered but dramatized, filled with passion, wit, and tragedy that transcended history itself. In his play, Cleopatra is no silent consort or distant queen. She speaks with fire, teasing Antony with playful words, rebuking him with sharp wit, and embracing him with tenderness. Shakespeare captured her contradictions, commanding yet vulnerable, proud yet tender, mortal yet radiant with something almost divine. Audiences watched in awe as she became not simply a historical figure, but a mirror of human complexity. Imagine the wooden stage of the Globe Theatre, torches flickering, a crowd gathered in the London twilight. An actor, for women were not yet permitted upon the stage, steps forward draped in robes of silk, portraying the Queen of the Nile. With each line, Cleopatra lives again her barge upon the water, her feasts in Alexandria, her final defiance against Rome. The audience listens enthralled, carried by the poetry of her voice. Shakespeare's Cleopatra was not the villain Augustus had crafted centuries before. She was a heroine of passion, her flaws as captivating as her triumphs. Her death scene, drawn out with words of beauty and dignity, lifted her beyond the reach of propaganda. "Give me my robe, put on my crown," she declares, choosing to meet death adorned as a queen. To Elizabethan audiences, her final act was both tragic and majestic, a reminder that dignity may be chosen even when power is lost. Beyond Shakespeare, other dramatists and poets followed. In France, Corneille wrote La Mort de Pompée and later works that evoked Cleopatra's grandeur. Across Europe, operas and masques staged her life, adorned with music and spectacle. Each retelling reshaped her, yet all retained the essence of her legend, a queen who lived intensely, loved deeply, and died defiantly. For audiences of the 17th and 18th centuries, Cleopatra became a vessel for their own dreams and anxieties. To some, she embodied the dangers of passion unchecked. To others, She symbolized the grandeur of love that defied empire. Her story could be molded to fit any moral or lesson, yet her presence always remained magnetic. Imagine a candlelit theater in Paris or Vienna, the air alive with music, actors upon the stage reciting lines of love and betrayal. Cleopatra appears, radiant in costume, her gestures graceful, her words filled with longing. The audience leans forward, caught in the spell of her fate, knowing the end yet yearning for it as if it were new. By the age of Shakespeare and beyond, Cleopatra was no longer confined to ancient scrolls or dusty chronicles. She had become immortal upon the stage. Her story lifted into art that lived in the breath of actors, in the notes of music, and in the hearts of those who listened. As you rest tonight, imagine her voice carried through centuries, echoing softly from the Globe Theatre's boards, through the grand halls of opera houses, into the quiet of your dreams. Cleopatra remains there still, a queen of words as much as of history, her story flowing on, unbroken by time. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Cleopatra's name had become a spark that lit the imaginations of poets, painters, and explorers alike. The world was changing. Europe was swept by Romanticism, a movement that adored passion, tragedy, and the grandeur of lost civilizations. In this age, Cleopatra was not only remembered, she was rediscovered, reimagined, and reborn as a symbol of mystery and allure. Romantic poets wrote of her as the eternal enchantress, a woman whose beauty could rival the gods and whose courage defied empire. They painted her in words as a figure of irresistible charm, both dangerous and divine. Some emphasized her love for Antony, casting her as the tragic heroine of an impossible romance. Others dwelled on her final act of defiance, describing the asp as her chosen companion into eternity, a gesture of sovereignty when all else was lost. Painters, too, found endless inspiration. Canvases of the 19th century glowed with images of Cleopatra's barge gliding along the Nile, its sails of purple billowing in the desert wind. Artists filled their works with silks, gold, and the deep blue of Egyptian skies. Her death became one of the century's favorite subjects, Cleopatra reclining on a couch of ivory, attendants collapsing in grief, the serpent poised against her arm. These paintings, dramatic and luminous, were less about accuracy than about feeling, capturing her as a muse of passion and tragedy. Archaeology also stirred her legend. As travelers and scholars explored the ruins of Egypt, fascination with Cleopatra grew alongside the fascination with pyramids and temples. Though her tomb remained elusive, the very mystery of its absence fed the imagination. Each new discovery of ancient inscriptions or statues was linked, however faintly, to the memory of the last queen who had stood against Rome. In Europe's grand salons, Cleopatra became a subject of conversation and fantasy. Writers compared her to queens of their own age, wondering if any ruler could match her intellect and magnetism. Composers wrote operas where her story unfolded through soaring music, her voice echoing across gilded theaters. Costumes and stage sets shimmered with Orientalist splendor, blending history and imagination into a vision of exotic majesty. For many, Cleopatra symbolized both the glory and the peril of desire. She was portrayed as the embodiment of love that could topple empires, as well as the courage that could face death with a crown upon the brow. Romanticism embraced contradiction, and Cleopatra embodied it perfectly. At once goddess and mortal, enchantress and mother, queen and exile. Imagine a gallery in Paris or London, filled with visitors gazing at vast canvases of Cleopatra's final hour. The air smells faintly of paint and varnish, footsteps echo softly upon the marble floor. Before them lies not history alone, but legend. Her serene face immortalized in brushstrokes, her story retold in color and light. Each viewer carries away a different Cleopatra, one of love, one of pride, one of sorrow. As you drift into rest, picture the 19th century world dreaming of her. Painters at their easels, poets at their desks, archaeologists brushing dust from stone. Across Europe, Cleopatra lived again, not in palaces or battlefields, but in art and memory. Her throne was gone, her empire absorbed, yet her story, like the Nile, continued to flow, eternal and unbroken. The 20th century carried Cleopatra from the pages of history books, and the canvases of painters onto a new stage, the world of cinema, theater, and global imagination. No longer confined to scholars and poets, she became a figure recognized by millions, her story projected onto silver screens and woven into popular culture. In the early decades of film, Cleopatra was portrayed in silent epics that dazzled audiences with lavish sets and costumes. Her barge, her jewels, and her tragic end came alive without words, only through the sweep of music and the flicker of images. Even without dialogue, the Queen of Egypt held her audience spellbound, her presence larger than life, but it was Hollywood's golden age that gave her immortality for a new century. In 1963, Elizabeth Taylor embodied Cleopatra in one of the most ambitious films ever made. Draped in gowns glittering with gold, eyes lined in kohl, Taylor's Cleopatra captivated the world. The film's grand sets recreated the splendor of Alexandria, its massive crowds echoed the power of empires, and its drama brought the love between Cleopatra and Antony into homes across the globe. For many, that image of Cleopatra, confident, radiant, defiant, became the one they carried in their minds forever. On stage, too, her story was revived. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra was performed in theaters worldwide, actresses now stepping into the role with their own voices, giving new life to lines once spoken by men. Each interpretation offered a different Cleopatra, some proud and regal, others tender and human, yet always magnetic. Writers of the 20th century reimagined her in novels, exploring her inner thoughts, her strategies, her private fears. Some told her story through her own voice, others through the eyes of those who served her. These works, whether faithful or fictional, showed how deeply her life still resonated. Readers longed to know not only the queen of legend but also the woman within. Cleopatra also became a symbol beyond art. For feminists, she represented female power in a world ruled by men. For dreamers, she embodied passion and independence. For Egypt itself, she stood as a reminder of its ancient glory, a woman whose name could never be erased even by conquest. Her story, once bound to the Nile, now belonged to the whole world. Imagine a darkened cinema, the screen glowing as Cleopatra steps into view, her barge adorned, her crown gleaming, her gaze unflinching. The audience, whether in London, Cairo, or New York, sits in silence, transported across centuries. For a moment, history and imagination merge, and the queen lives again. By the close of the 20th century, Cleopatra was more than a figure of the past. She had become a global icon, present in classrooms and libraries, in theaters and films, in the minds of children and scholars alike. She was no longer only Egypt's queen, she was humanity's legend, reborn with each telling, each performance, each image. As you rest tonight, picture her face illuminated upon a cinema screen, timeless yet familiar, her story flowing from antiquity into modern dreams. The night is quiet, the stars eternal, and Cleopatra, last of the pharaohs, still walks among us, through art, through memory, through the endless retellings of her life. Through centuries of retelling, Cleopatra has never truly left the stage of history. From the banks of the Nile to the streets of Rome, from medieval manuscripts to Renaissance paintings, from Shakespeare's stage to Hollywood's screen, her story has flowed like the river she once called home. Each age has reshaped her. Queen, lover, enchantress, scholar, tragic heroine. Yet beneath every version lies the same unbroken truth. She lived and died with dignity, and the world has never forgotten her. In Egypt, her presence still lingers. The Nile continues its eternal rhythm, the pyramids rise against the horizon, and the ruins of Alexandria whisper fragments of her memory. Travelers gaze upon ancient stones, imagining the queen who once walked their halls, her voice echoing in courts filled with music and debate. Though her tomb remains lost, perhaps forever, the mystery only deepens her legend. In Rome, her name has never faded. Once spoken as a warning, later sung in verse, Cleopatra became part of the very fabric of empire. Augustus claimed victory, but even he could not erase her. Instead, her image haunted the empire he built, a reminder that power is never absolute, and that even conquest cannot silence a sovereign who chooses her own fate. In art, her figure has endured in endless forms. She gazes from coins struck with her profile, From frescoes painted centuries after her death, from statues, canvases, stages, and screens. Each artist who has touched her story has left behind not just history, but interpretation. A reflection of Cleopatra as they imagined her. She has become both woman and idea, both mortal and myth. For women across time, she has symbolized strength in a world that sought to limit them. For poets, she has embodied beauty tinged with sorrow. For historians, she has been puzzle and paradox. To each, she offers something different, and that is why she has never been forgotten. Imagine the long thread of centuries, each marked by voices speaking her name. A scribe in Byzantium, a painter in Florence, a playwright in London, a filmmaker in Hollywood, all connected by her story. Cleopatra's life, once bound to Egypt's throne, has become boundless, reaching across cultures and languages, reminding the world of the power of presence, the endurance of memory. And so her story drifts to you now, carried on quiet words meant to soothe. You have walked with her through temples and palaces, through battlefields and banquets, through triumph and sorrow. You have seen her as queen, as mother, as lover, as legend. And now, as the night deepens, you may let her rest. Close your eyes and picture the Nile beneath a sky of silver stars. The water flows calm and eternal, reflecting constellations that have watched humanity since the dawn of time. Somewhere in its depths lies the memory of Cleopatra, still radiant, still sovereign, still unforgettable. Her journey is complete, her crown set gently in history, her name inscribed forever in the hearts of those who dream. And as you drift into your own rest, may her story carry you like the Nile itself, steady and serene, toward the quiet shores of sleep.